Dear colleagues and friends, welcome again. It is our second session that begins shortly. As it has been said, in this conference, conviviality prevails. So there is no formality in the presentation of our colleagues, but I have to say that it is not only an honor for our team, but a very great personal pleasure for me to have with us as keynote speaker in this evening session, Professor Antoine Vauchez. Antoine is a research professor in political sociology in the Centre européen de sociologie et des sciences politiques à Paris and Sorbonne, SNRS, and a permanent visiting professor at ICOT Center of Excellence in Copenhagen. I will not at all refer at his work. I only want to mention that a few months ago he has published a book. I didn't have the opportunity to read it, but I will do it, Antoine, in the next days. It seems me very interesting. It's the Neoliberal Republic, Corporate Lawyers, Statecraft, and the Making of Public-Private France. So, Antoine, you have the floor. Bienvenue à Thessalonique, même de cette façon fictive.
Merci. Merci, Ifigeneia. I hope you hear me well. I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I'm very sad I can spend time with you in person. I hope we'll have possibility to compensate for that soon. And of course, I am also very honored to be invited to this conference.
Wait a minute, please. There was a problem. Okay.
All good?
Go on.
Okay. So, well, I'm all the more honored that I'm actually not that much of a specialist of populist constitutionalism as such, and I have learned a lot by hearing you and reading you but I came to the subject somehow by the back door as I was getting interested and working on EU institutions, basically, and in particular EU independent institutions that claim to be somehow outside of the circuit of representative democracy. Thinking in particular about the Court of Justice of the European Union, about the European Central Bank, and the more I was interested in these institutions, the more I got interested in the notion of independence, which is a sort of extremely important legitimatory device for these institutions, these supranational institutions. But at the same time, they're also highly contested concept, particularly in times of populism. Independent policy making, to put that under a broad umbrella, meaning regulators, central banking, constitutional courts, all sorts of independent policy making is, of course, and we've seen that already, under a strong criticism in the context of populist constitutionalism. What struck me in particular with that notion of independence was that it had become precisely one of the most central and ubiquitous political category of our time, particularly of institutional struggles. And at the same time, the fact that we still have a difficulty defining, what independence means for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that most often we study independence or independent institutions, I would say sector by sector. You know, lawyers would tend to study courts, political scientists will probably study regulators, economists will probably study central banks. But the fact that independence has become such a cross-cutting category of the political and of the democracy today somehow is rarely investigated as such. And that somehow got me into an interest in this. And of course, there is a particular actuality of this. As we've been discussing, the notion of independence is central in the populist backlash in Hungary and Poland. Ever since the return to power of Fidesz and of peace, the question of judicial independence is, of course, and the definition of judicial independence, its scope, its meaning, its counterbalancing principle, its general mode of interpretation, all of that is a point of contention between the EU in particular and the governments and the parliament, etc. But it's also true about the European Central Bank in the context of the financial crisis. The central bank has also been put under strong fire by the German Constitutional Court, and one of the key debates is about independence. You know, what is the scope of the independence of the European Central Bank? Is it something that has to be interpreted in a limited way, as the German Constitutional Court suggests? Or is it something that is related to the broad discretionary powers of the central bank in accomplishing its mandate in monetary policy, etc.? So, in a way, the word has become a sort of a proxy for a variety of institutional battles, in particular, I would say, constitutional battles over the competence, the jurisdiction of the EU, in particular, of course, between the national and the EU, with a variety of institutions coming and giving its own definition of independence. I mean, the Court of Justice, the German Constitutional Court, national parliaments, national governments, European Commission, constitutional courts, and it has become a sort of a whole battle over the notion of independence. So, of course, you know, I recently came across, you know, the white paper that the Polish government wrote about the reform of the Polish judiciary in 2018, a white paper, Wojciech, I think he was here earlier today, mentioned in his book, and this white paper is extremely interesting in the fact that it builds somehow a sort of counter theory of independence, anchored in national democratic traditions, drawing on parallels with French constitutional law, with German constitutional law in terms of comparative law of the independence of the judiciary. And, you know, strikingly, in 60 pages, the word independence is mentioned 77 times. So it's a sort of obsession to, you know, define what independence means. And it's the same with the Hungarian parliament, government, which responded to the Sargentini report of the European Parliament on breach of the rule of law, again with its own counter theory, if you want, of independence, somehow countering, you know, the notion that the European Commission is pushing through its rule of law framework. So it is what Walter Bryce Galley in the 50s called an essentially contested concept. And what do we do with essentially contested concepts? Well, we cannot resolve the issue in abstract terms. We cannot say, you know, this is the right definition in that battle, and I know as a scholar how to put it. what Walter Bryce Galley suggests is that the only way is to look at usages of the notion and to look historically how the various arguments over independence and the independence wars, as I say in the title, have been fought in the context of the EU. So of course you might say that independence wars happen somehow everywhere in contemporary world, in contemporary politics. Why? Because expertise and expert-based institutions that all basically claim independence from politics is not a peculiarity of the EU and of Europe, generally speaking. But I would argue that there is something specific about the EU and independence, and that's basically what I would like to defend as an argument. I think there is, when we look at these battles over independence, we usually, in Europe, we usually consider, the populist backlash, and we see the populist backlash as the origin of these battles on independence, and that's certainly true. I'm not contesting this at all, but there is another story about that. The reason for which independence is so critical and so contested, and that other reason is that, in my point of view, and historically, the EU has defined itself very much around the notion of independence. In a way, the notion of independence has been, through the court, through the Commission, through the European Central Bank, one of the, if not the essential lever for which Europe, I mean the EU, has gained and claimed for competence and jurisdiction. In a way, I would say independence has been, in the context of the EU, somehow weaponized, I would say, to the goal somehow of establishing the jurisdiction of the EU. So to show this, and or to explain a little bit what I mean by this, I would like to sketch very briefly what could be a history of the concept as it enters in contact with the EU. Something I think we should be doing, and I'm just sketching this, and it's just for the sake of discussion, but is engaging a history of the debates over the definition of independence all along the history of the European Union, and how it became so much entangled in a way with the emergence and the strengthening of the EU. So I think the EU somehow can be analyzed as a laboratory, a new laboratory of independence. I think the EU, in particular, lawyers, economists, and institutions such as the Court, the European Central Bank, of the Commission, has been a locus, a terrain where new theories of independence have emerged, new notions of what independence is for, that are very important to analyze. I think there are two elements that emerge, and that's again an hypothesis in the history of independence in the EU, two distinctive elements of a European theory of independence, if you want, a European avatar of independence. One is a redefinition of independence, moving from a notion where independence is essentially a negative technique, something independence from, protecting protecting the rule of law, protecting the courts, central bank from excessive, reach of the political. Then that's the traditional liberal understanding Paul Blokker was mentioning earlier today of somehow this liberal constitutionalism. So independence from, and what I'm arguing is that in the context of the EU, progressively we move to an understanding of independence as independence for, independence as somehow a governing technique, a lever of empowerment of institutions in the name of the European project, in the name of advancing the European project and its sort of teleological rationale, and so reinventing in a way independence as yes, as a legitimate device in the name of Europe's general interest. And that is, of course, very strong for the Court of Justice, the European Commission, and even more recently for the European Central Bank. The second distinctive element, I think, of a European notion of independence, of EU avatar of independence, is the fact that independence is increasingly understood, and it's particularly clear in the crisis of the rule of law right now. Independence is increasingly understood in the EU context as something that is cross-sectoral, not something that has only its own sector-specific rationale, be for the judiciary or for the central banks or for the regulators, but something that is somehow cross-sector, something that is a sort of common systemic concept around precisely the notion of the European project, and a notion of that could be put under the umbrella of an independent branch, as Mayone, for example, would have said some years ago. So that's basically what I am trying to argue in a paper that I can circulate if you're interested, by looking at three critical junctures, three constitutional crises in which somehow the EU has been a laboratory for a new understanding of independence, the one I was trying to sketch hypothetically right now. I have taken three moments in which precisely there is competing theorizations, competing definitional battles around what independence means and to what extent it's a principle of legitimation. The first one is the foundational years of the 1960s in the EU, when the European Union is looking for, and its lawyers and its high civil servants are trying to make sense of this new polity. You know, what is the logic, underlying logic of the EU? And of course, this is a matter of debate and of struggles. And in that context, the notion of independence that these people have initially is a notion of independence that is somehow a legacy from the League of Nations, a legacy from the building of former international organizations, where independence and the technique, the institutional technique of independence is used to protect individual civil servants, individual judges from the pressure of the diplomats, the pressure of the political. So it's quite a traditional understanding of the functions of independence. But what is interesting is the transformation in the mid-60s, when the idea of a constitutional, of treaties as a constitution, of European treaties as making up a constitutional arrangement or settlement, then the notion of independence, the notion, the independence of the Commission, of its civil servants, of its commissioners, the independence of the Court of Justice become not just an issue of protecting individual civil servants and judges, but becomes the foundation for the objective role that the Commission and the Court have to play in service of this new constitutional order, of this new constitutional settlement. So in a way, as the EU moves to a new understanding of itself in the mid-60s with the constitutional paradigm, the notion of independence becomes critical in that, because it's the foundational legitimacy of the Constitution, of the Commission and of the Court in their role as pushing, advancing the European project and defending the European Constitution. So I think this is a first moment of interest, a moment when precisely independence is functionalized around core values of the EU, you know, Europe's general interest as embodied by the Commission and the Court, Europe's general project as you know, interpreted by the Commission and the Court, etc. So that would be a first moment of redefinition of the notion of independence. A second one, and I try to be brief on the next two, because I want to hear, you know, I want to discuss and know what you may think of this. The second element and critical juncture of interest, I think, is the arrival, the creation of the European Central Bank. Because the European Central Bank, created in 1998, is a totally new independent institution. And interestingly, it comes with its own theory of independence. And the theory of independence of the European Central Bank is not based on Europe's constitutional charter. It's not based on Europe's constitutional paradigm. The notion of independence for the European Central Bank, for central bankers at the time, is essentially understood in the terms of monetary theory. It's not a legal understanding, it's a monetary theory. And it's very far away from the values of the European project and from the understanding, you know, of European treaties as a constitution. Some of you may remember or know that the lawyers of the central bank came with a theory that the European Central Bank was not just independent from politicians, but it had to be understood as independent from the community, as another community that was different from the community, and in that sense, was not somehow subjected to all EU law, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an incredibly strong and expansive understanding of the independence of the European Central Bank. And what is interesting is, of course, I guess the controversy that followed between this theory, the German Constitutional Court, which defended an understanding of independence as anchored in national democratic traditions, and a third understanding, which was the one of the Court of Justice, which claimed that independence was to be understood in the framework of Europe's constitution, if you want, Europe Constitutional Charter. So what is you know, it's a decade-long debate, you know, with 2 decades-long debate actually, and struggle in a way. One element I would say of particular interest is that progressively the bank, the central bank, and the Court of Justice have approximated, have come closer and closer in understanding of independence. First, because the European Central Bank soon understood that its legal defense was rather weak, particularly vis-a-vis the German Constitutional Court. And so progressively, it got interested into law. You know, the first ECB law conference takes place, I think, in 2012. The first time, in a way, the ECB starts to, you know, engage with the EU law academic crowd. You know, at the first conference, Draghi quotes with the lawyers, half jokingly, he quotes Shakespeare when he says, you know, the only good lawyers are killed lawyers. I don't exactly if that's the dead lawyers or something. And half jokingly, but you can see that there is a progressive understanding that the European Central Bank has to put its authority under the umbrella, the general umbrella of EU Constitutional Charter. And so it's a story where progressively, in a way, the independent branch of the EU is amplified, if you want, by the adjunction of a third independent, not only the Commission, not only the court, but the central bank as being part of this branch of independent policy making. And then third and last critical and juncture and constitutional crisis I would like to discuss is the one in Central Europe, in particular the debate and the conflict opened with the rise of right-wing populist parties in Poland and in Hungary. And it's an interesting moment, again, on the notion of independence. The battle is reopened. And I don't want to be too long, but one of the interesting aspects of this crisis, I think, is the way the European Central Bank, the court, and the Commission tend to adopt an understanding of independence as a systemic notion, not only a notion of its own institution, not only an object of value for its own institution, but an object of value for the EU and Europe as a whole. So there's a redefinition in a way of independence as a systemic notion. Of course, the Commission is very important in that, but the European Central Bank also writes its first papers on the rule of law in 2019 and says, we have to defend explicitly independent policy making from all the attacks. And progressively, there is a notion that there is a general value of independence that is not only connected to judicial independence or central bank independence, but to more generally the value of independence, expertise, and in the European Union. And this, of course, is of importance, not just as as a redefinition, but because it gives to the bank, the court, and the Commission, of course, a strong weapon to protect its own its national independence, its national counterparts, national central banks, national constitutional courts, national regulators, and to build somehow and expand the notion of independent branch, which is not anymore just the notion of EU supranational institutions, but the notion that there is something systemically important, if I can say, about independence that is somehow at the core of the definition of the EU, and which extends not only to EU institutions, strictly speaking, but also to national independence. So here we are. I'm gonna stop here by saying that what I'm trying to do here is to somehow open the black box of independence, which is often a notion that we keep in the back, somehow with the idea that it's self-explanatory, or sometimes with the idea that it's a stable notion historically. And I think to the contrary, that independence has become the core battleground. I mean, one of the crossroads of all political battles over the definition of the EU and the definition of the relationship between the EU and national member states. So I think I think it's interesting to really dig into these independence wars, to understand how the EU has been a laboratory for new notions, new understandings of independence. In particular, how independence is somehow at the core of Europe's political legitimacy. And I think this is probably one of the most interesting paradox, that a sort of apolitical principle has become one of the key legitimatory device of the EU in terms of political grammar or political legitimacy. So what we have to do as scholars maybe is, I guess, to try maybe to sometimes well, look at all these huge usages of this notion, all these battles, and see how somehow the genie of independence has come out of the bottle in a way, and you know, by forms of overstretching of the notion in variety of contexts. And I think this is very important for to become aware of, you know, forms of democratic risks that can be involved with an overstretching of the notion. So I guess this is what we could do as scholars, is recognize how independence has become so historically rooted in the EU and in its political grammar and political way of legitimacy, and question in a way the current context with these lenses. Voila. Thanks for your attention, and I look for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Antoine. It was very interesting to hear how new notions serve to the refoundation of power, send people home, and give another basis to the power. Paul Blokker asked the floor. Please, Paul. Okay. Anybody is invited to take the floor. Goffredo, you have the floor. Goffredo.
I want to, yes. Do you hear me? Yes. It's very interesting talk, because I think that the notion of independence it was a form to reintroduce the early liberalism, as Bobbio explained, this contrast between democracy and liberalism. And of course, is the same way of Pierre Rosanvallon, the Society of Distrust, try to establish several independent institutions. And here, the populists have a huge ground, because they say nothing is democracy. Everything is based on independent institution. And that was interesting of your talk, because obliged me to think about independence, and not thinking, of course, that they have populists have a huge grounds. And what is dangerous that what the populists propose in constitutional terms is to escape and giving just a democracy without liberalism, and democracy without liberalism led to a plebiscitarian regime. And maybe we have to come back to Bobbio in establishing something that is in the middle between this very hard balance between liberalism and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I?
Antoine, est-ce que je peux lire quelque chose qui est écrit sur le chat?
Bien sûr.
C'est Aeyal Gross qui says that it is very interesting that the party pushing for Brexit was United Kingdom Independence Party, using independence language to argue for UK leaving Europe. Paul Blokker says he cannot, from some reason, take the floor, but he applauded. And
now he can now. So if Paul,
okay, Paul, please take the floor.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I was sort of censorized before, but I actually applauded indeed. But I'm also happy to take the floor because I find it fascinating what Antoine is trying to do here. And I just had a couple of considerations. One thing is, of course, around the institution of the European Commission, where it seems to me that there is by now a fairly broad acknowledgement in different ways that its independence cannot hold. Like I'm thinking of the Spitzenkandidaten procedure and things like that, that seem to at least push for a politicization of the Commission. So I wonder what your take is on that in your larger argument. And that's exactly the argument that I find so fascinating, this argument about independence for, as in a way intrinsic to the European project itself. And that I find really interesting. The second thing is, how do you see the relation between the, let's call it indeed an imaginary of independence as some kind of principle, a fundamental principle of various European institutions, together with what is in the end a political project. Like you mentioned, the rule of law crisis. I mean, the whole sort of the attempt to create a political set of instruments around the rule of law mechanism, about the now annual reporting business, etc. In a way, is a project that seems to push for a kind of harmony in terms of how we understand the rule of law. But in reality, is of course it's a technique. It's an attempt to close certain voices, to close down certain ideas, and to promote another one. So, I mean, it seems to me that independence, and that's what I actually wanted to say, is actually a full-blown political concept, rather than a technocratic technique or so. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I, Ifigeneia, what do you think? Should I answer now?
If there is no other, I think
well,
there is no other.
I'm happy to start. And thank you for all the interesting questions. Well, first on the UKIP, I think it's interesting. There are indeed two, to use Paul's word, two imaginaries of independence. You know, historically, the notion of independence comes with the notion of political sovereignty. You know, independent. You know, for independent countries to you know, from former colonies. So it's all but something connected to expertise and to technocracy. And I guess somehow the UKIP and you know, and the taking back control type of rhetoric somehow plays with that tradition, plays on that tradition of independence as a concept connected to political sovereignty. But there is another imaginary, which is the one that has most currency in the EU, which is connected to expertise, professions, particularly lawyers and economists, and expert-based institutions whose functioning requires expertise and independence. So when the court defends the bank, the central banks, the European Central Bank defends its prerogatives, it does so by saying, you know, the central bank needs to keep it's fully sovereign in terms of its expertise, in terms of its technique to build its diagnosis of the economic situation, etc. So at the core of the understanding of independence in the EU is the notion of the independent expert, the independent professional, and its representative institution in a way, which are courts for lawyers, central banks for economists, etc. Then, of course, I agree with you, Paul. The European Commission is a sort of a front line of the debate over over these EU institutions. I'm not saying that the European Commission is an independent institution, but I'm saying that an essential element of its institutional identity remains independence. And somehow, when it gets to somehow the core powers of the European Commission, I mean competition policy, I mean market integration, and all sorts of regulatory agencies that populate and work around the Commission. They work in a very and they have secured a very independent position within the Commission. So of course, I'm not denying that there is also a trend of politicization, but I think it's very much on the surface and very much a politicization in the sense that commissioners have more political capital. They're more ministers than they used to be. They're more former ministers or MPs than they used to be. So they have more political capital. But then the rationale of the institution, its legitimacy vis-a-vis member states, remains very much the traditional one. And I remember Pierre Moscovici, former commissioner from France, socialist and French, who came to the audition at the European Parliament when he had to be confirmed, and he started by saying, "I'm socialist and I'm French, but as a European Commissioner, I will act as an independent arbitrator in between member states." So it's striking that as you take up the role of a commissioner, it's very difficult to play the political, to play the sort of partisan politics card. And that remains very, very true, which does not mean there's no politics, but, it's a specific type of politics. And then on the contradictions you were mentioning between the European political project and the fact that independence is essentially a technique. But I fully understand, I fully agree on this paradox. I think in a way, the European Union is producing a specific type of statesman, what I've called the statesman of independence. I mean, examples like Mario Monti or Mario Draghi, or other representatives of these Commission, Court, and Central Bank, with somehow have a sort of political career in between technocracy and politics. And this is the positioning of a, you know, even in the European Parliament, the amount of people with a PhD, for example, in law, economics, or political science is a third of the MPs, which, you know, in France is probably 5 or 6% of the MPs. So it shows that there is, you know, a politics, but a politics of experts and a specific type of statesman, and that is somehow the specificity of the way politics is done in the EU, and of course explains the difficulty of parties like Syriza getting to power with a very strong partisan identity, playing partisan politics, index where this has, I'm not saying no value, but little value. Is not, you know, the most efficient way of defending your interest in the, to come out with your partisan somehow cap. And, you know, the memoir of Vauchez are very interesting in that regard, because it shows, you know, the sort of the level of puzzlement of the other European leaders who play the role when Varoufakis gets to the Eurogroup summits. And of course, you see that there is sort of a gap, which is in itself very, very telling. Voilà. Thanks for all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Antoine. And now we are going to our third session. And I would like to welcome Professor Gross from Tel Aviv. I repeat, no formality, but I cannot retain myself to thank Professor Gross for his participation and say how big is my pleasure to accept him even in this way in Thessaloniki. I will not speak